Oh, I see it. The clock turned 6 o'clock here. So I want to officially welcome the curatorial team of the Meret Oppenheim on exposition, my exhibition that is joining here online. I am very happy and honored that my colleagues were able to join us via Zoom here. We're starting with an Umland senior curator at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, who is in the middle of installation of her current show. So she will be only able to join us for a little short while, but we're very happy that you're giving us some of your very precious time, this heated moment. And we have Natalie Dupêcher joining us from Houston. She's the curator of the Meret Oppenheim exhibition that will go to Houston as the next venue, the Menil. And we are welcoming everybody who has tuned in here. I currently see we're 23. And we wanted to share with you all how this exhibition came to be and how we worked on it. And for a good long period of it, we worked on it just like this on Zoom. Maybe we start, Anne, with you. What was your first encounter with Meret Oppenheim, and then what happened? How did we get to this point here today?
Yes, in one sentence or more. So my first encounter with Meret Oppenheim, being here at the Museum of Modern Art, was through her fur teacup and her painting, Redhead, Blue Body, both of which are on pretty much permanent view in our galleries. And so she's always been an artist who's, she's legendary just because of that. And I guess this project in particular, as I recall, Meret Oppenheim is like on those lists of artists that you think, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do a show of their work at some point? And then the catalyst, as I recall, but maybe Natalie and Nina will remember differently, was Nina called us up, MoMA, and invited us to partner with her and the Menil Collection on organizing a Meret Oppenheim retrospective. And, from our point of view, if the director of the greatest collection of Meret Oppenheim works in the world calls up and said, would you like to partner on a Meret Oppenheim project? Like, you just say, of course. So that's how I remember it. And that was back in March of 2018. I looked in my calendar date book. So
wow. And then when did we have our first physical meeting? I think it started with a physical meeting, Natalie. Where did that happen?
Yes, I think that was in October. So a little more than exactly 3 years ago. In October of 2018, I think, is when Anne and I and the director of the Menil Collection, Rebecca Rabineau, all went to Bern for the first time. And it was my first time meeting you, Nina, and Nora, the curatorial assistant on the project in Bern. And we had our kind of kickoff meeting where we, as I recall, went to the storage at the museum and started, pulling out just racks and racks of Meret Oppenheim paintings, and which was incredible because, I think my first encounter with Meret Oppenheim, as Anne's, was through the fur-covered teacup. She has this sort of funny situation of being incredibly well-known, but as we can maybe talk about later, also in many ways underknown. But that was really the first object that I knew her for. And so to see, dozens and dozens of works that we could just pick from for our show was, of course, extremely exciting and inspiring.
And what were your first impressions like when, and now we saw the work again and again and again, but can you go back to the moment when you first saw so much work of an artist you thought you knew, and then there was like so much that you had never seen? And what were your first thoughts? Maybe Anne.
Well, I'm curious if I can almost turn that question around to you too, Nina, because if we may, just to say, when did you, being the director of the Kunstmuseum Bern, do you feel like you always knew? How did you first get to know Meret Oppenheim? And were you aware of the scope of her work always?
Oh, absolutely not. But I think of myself as a very patchy art historian. So I have my very few tiny islands where I feel comfortable, and I'm always aware of like all the oceans of the unknown that are around this. And I knew practically nothing except like a handful of works, a few paintings I knew better that are in the collection of the Kunstmuseum Basel, where I used to work before coming to Bern.
Yes.
And I was always trying to look to acquire more work of Meret Oppenheim for Basel. And I realized that oftentimes what I would encounter on the art market would completely not match my expectation, what I want a Meret Oppenheim work to be like. and to be fully honest with you both, when I first saw like the entire, and our holdings are huge. It's many works on paper that I had never seen before when we both went through the entire oeuvre. Like a lot of the work first didn't match my expectation. Because I had a prefixed idea of what Meret Oppenheim should be like.
That's interesting, because back to your question, like what are our memories of sort of encountering that, in corpus of work for the first time? I felt overwhelmed, like you're in water, it's almost like learning and not quite knowing at the beginning, like what was important and what wasn't. There weren't works that said, oh my gosh, right, this is like the one, we have to have this. I felt like it was getting to know her language slowly. And then the more we looked, then I felt like, oh, I have an opinion about these works. I don't know, Natalie, you're more like.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that one thing that struck me pretty early on was the constant interest in unorthodox materials, right? Something that happens, in the very early 30s. Obviously, it's evident in the Fräulein teacup, but going through the racks of paintings and works on paper, even in those, we would find, that she used dried up leaves or all kinds of fun collage papers, or she had pasted like a little like cutout otter to, or like an old sort of smashed tin can to a late assemblage called Finally News from Our Astronauts, or News from Astronauts at Last. So beginning to end, that was one thing that I think really struck me early on, was that she was always, always interested in those non-art materials and in incorporating those kinds of non-art things into her paintings and works on paper and objects and, in the variety of media in which she worked.
Yeah, but that was a through line. I'm remembering we became, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. I just tried to find better words for my insecurities about Meret Oppenheim, and I think it is because, like all the curators and a lot of the authors we read in the preparation for the exhibition, I had an image of her as a surrealist artist with a modernist conception of an artwork, with the modernist art frame. And I think my idea changed when I realized that, almost like what you said, Natalie, like with all her experimentation, she's going beyond what the concept of a modernist artwork is, especially in the later work. Like the more you advance, the more she's stepping out of the modernist frame, and a postmodernist frame is helping me to deal with all her looseness and her rebelling and her not fitting into any parameters, and precisely making a point of being beyond all the parameters. And I think that was, for me, the transition I needed to go through to come to grips with like the entire breadth and width of her work.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's interesting. I wonder, like thinking of her as a postmodernist was useful. I also, and I don't know if the two of you would agree with me, but I found thinking of her almost as a conceptual artist for whom the idea comes first and then the form, like is something that's helpful, because that helps to, the idea comes, then she finds the right form for it. Her ideas are intensely and incredibly varied, right from medieval heroines to alpine landscapes to, you know, I don't know, Adolf Wolfli's Princess, like they're really all over the place. And she finds like a material that suits them. Sometimes it's oil on canvas, sometimes it's not. But that idea, I think that it speaks to your point about she's not a modernist. Also, she's like a conceptual artist. She's a postmodern artist. She begins from a different place with incredible freedom.
Yes. So I think this physical encounter with so much of her work, you know, changed for all of us, you know, our thoughts, especially with an artist where you know and you see in the collections so little of, like, her, you know, it's not that every major museum has 20 Meret Oppenheims.
Right.
You know, when we later started to borrow work, it happened to be that, you know, oftentimes it's one work that's in one collection, two works, and it's she's not one of these artists. You know, I don't. You know, there's certain artists they're inevitable, and and that are spread evenly through the European and North American collections. She's not. She's very spotty and, but then surprisingly present. Suddenly.
Yes. Particularly, would you say it's fair in Switzerland? Like I was thinking of all the different reasons why her post-war career remains so invisible in the United States, and there just aren't the works aren't here at all. But anyway, on that, but like not so great point, I have to go. I'm so sorry, all you audience, and I hope you can tell how much I love talking to Nina and Natalie about Meret Oppenheim. So I'm going to go install Sophie Teuber
up, who's another great artist, and all the best for that installation. And it was great to have you.
Yes, thank you
so much.
Goodbye. Take care.
Yeah, so I think that we were just at the point of maybe the audience is interested, how do you start creating an exhibition? And we started at, you know, how we met, how we agreed on doing this exhibition together. And then we all met and looked at a lot of work together, also to start to choose works. And maybe that's another, like, how did we continue to choose work? That's maybe something that's difficult to think about, like when a lot of the work is in Switzerland, some work is in the US, and some work is in other places. There's so many places.
Yeah. I mean, I think that trip in October of 2018 was really foundational when we saw, you know, maybe not all 100%, but almost all the works then that were in the Kunstmuseum Bern collection, as well as a couple other important collections in that area. And then in 2019, yes, this was before the pandemic, Anne and I were able to make a couple of viewing trips to look at a lot of things in different collections. So we had one kind of mega trip in June of 2019, where we were based in Zurich, and every day would take the train out and go to a different museum or collection or institution in Switzerland, and really tried to sort of survey everything, you know, in Switzerland, which was quite a lot. But as you said, it was often, you know, one object in one museum collection. And so you would just go and see that, and we decided we loved it, or we thought it was, you know, not essential for our presentation of the career. And at the end of this viewing trip, we would end in Bern and bring our report and our photographs to Nina and Nora and discuss everything that we had seen and our impressions of it all together. And from those, from that first trip, sort of made a, you know, began to collect a kind of a list of objects. And then independent from those, or in addition to those, you know, large sort of major visits that we did, Anne and you, Nina, and I were also, as possible, making our own little side trips to things that were easier for us to see just on our own. So I know that, Nina, you made a lot of trips to other collections around Switzerland and Germany that Anne and I hadn't been able to kind of Tetris into our travels at various points.
And of course, you covered a lot of the US works. And maybe that's an interesting point for those who don't constantly curate Meret Oppenheim exhibitions. We sort of set a code of ethics for us that's not the same for every exhibition I've worked on. And this was, we vowed that we would view every work in the original before we would request it. So to really, you know, to really get and ideally see the original, all three of us, but then we realized that was maybe a too high standard of ethics, especially when the pandemic hit and we couldn't travel as much. But we kept the level of having seen in the originally all the works we chose, at least one, or in most cases, two of us had seen.
Yes, which was very, obviously, you know, fortunate, I think, for us to be able to do that, but was really, in my opinion, kind of essential, because there were so many surprises, works that we had seen in reproduction, in, you know, exhibition catalogs, or in 1989, Meret Oppenheim published the English language version of her catalog, Raisonné. The German one was from 1982, and that reproduces, you know, small black and white images of every work that she made, which was, of course, an indispensable resource, but is, you know, sometimes it was hard to find images beyond those little black and white reproductions. And so we often didn't totally know what we were kind of getting ourselves into, and would often be quite surprised at how something that had seemed quite unassuming had a great sort of presence to it once you saw it in real life.
Can you share, maybe, you know, anonymizing the name of the private collector a little bit, so it's okay to talk about that wonderful story, how you found that one object in a private collection in a US university town?
Yes, so I had been speaking with a former professor of mine about this Meret Oppenheim exhibition, and through sort of a funny chain of professors talking to professors, learned that one professor owned a Meret Oppenheim painting from the mid-1930s that had been included in Meret Oppenheim's first major solo show that was held in Basel in the spring of 1936. This person's grandparents had purchased that canvas from the artist directly from Oppenheim, and it had just stayed in that family for, since 1936, so for 85 years. And to my knowledge, hadn't been, that fact hadn't really been known. It hadn't really been exhibited, right, in other Meret Oppenheim retrospectives, of which there have been, at least in Europe, quite a few. So it was a great sort of, and very, funny and kind of, perfect sort of synchronicity to be able to find this painting, which is the owner very generously agreed to lend to all three venues of the retrospective. So it's looking very great in one of the early galleries in Bern. It'll come to Houston in the spring and then go to MoMA next fall in about 1 year, actually. So that was one example where that painting, we knew it, we quote unquote knew it from a little black and white photograph, but hadn't seen it in color and certainly not in real life. And that was in fact a visit. Anne and Lee Cologne, the curatorial assistant at MoMA, saw the painting, I believe in December of 2019. I saw it in February of 2020, of course, not knowing that it would be the last collection visit made until many, many months later. So that was, I think, one of the great sort of serendipitous, funny discoveries that I had, at least. But you found a lot. There were a lot.
There's always that, I think this was like a total breakthrough moment. And when you shared the images with us, we were like over the moon. And, I think for us, it was maybe seeing the Toter Falter, Dead Moth work, private collection in Switzerland, and like we were able to see it under the condition that we would not even ask for it for the retrospective. It was out of reach, impossible, but we were able to at least have a glimpse of it. And I was so in love from the first moment. And through many talks and our chief conservator helped to convince the lender that there is a way to safely bring the work, unfortunately only to Bern, and this was already almost impossible.
Right.
From another Swiss city to Bern, and we're just very happy that this work that has not been exhibited for over 40 years almost is now in the exhibition. So these are the moments where you're like, oh my God, this is the breakthrough moment.
And I think it was so wonderful to see how many works really are coming from someone's like living room wall. Their paintings or objects or drawings that they really do live with, but that they believe in Oppenheim enough and want to present her in this big transatlantic retrospective, that they're willing to part with something that really is quite a something that they live with every day. I thought that was a really sort of special part of the show. And so many too who knew the artist or had bought work directly from her was also really, really interesting. A lot of people, that from whom we were borrowing works, like shared memories of her or knowing her in the Bern art scene in the 70s or 60s, which was really fun.
This was a big surprise also to me, how many people have like a vivid memory or like a shared history with Meret. And an artist who is so much a part in like ancient art history, like the 30s, Surrealism, Paris, 33, 36. It was such a brush of history being present that even in the wherever I would go in the Kunstmuseum Bern art handling team, one of our art handlers had known her and had a history to share. Our head of education had met her at an art opening, and of course I would also talk a lot about Meret Oppenheim in the last years because she was constantly on my mind. But I was gifted with so many stories of people who had very different connections, who shared and she changed the life and the spirit for so many people and was such an important connector. And as she lived until 85, it's not a surprise that many of these people are still around to share their memories with us, which felt very lucky for us.
Yes, yeah, I think it's really special that the show is originating then in Bern, where it has this sort of, is really grounded in that, and where she lived for many years, and where there are so many memories that people have and bring to the show when they're maybe encountering works that they saw, years and years ago, which is so great, and probably not something we will have in Houston, but
I think it will.
Maybe we will.
It will take on different qualities. Like, of course, Meret here is also a regional artist in some way, and I think that's something interesting about our collaboration, that she can make that transition to the international artist she also so much is. By us bringing her to the 3 different audiences that our institutions stand for, right? And we realized this over the course of our reading, how different also our audiences are and what we're expecting from this exhibition. I think we need to also now move forward to the point in history where we had made all these interesting trips, we had met each other, we had located work, and then it was March 2020, and of course the lockdown came in all of our countries and all the countries where the work is located. And I remember Switzerland closed on March 20th, and this was the day we were supposed to send out all the loan requests, and there were news out that the postal service would no longer function internationally, that there had been interruptions of the international post chain. So we decided to send a digital copy of all our letters immediately. And of course, we went to home office. So right here, I'm in my home office right now. So I was sitting here on my sofa, sending out all the loan requests in the digital copy during the night of March 20th. During the lockdown, I thought would last 3 weeks.
Right. At that point, we were like, yeah, it'll be fine. Back in, May. Not worry. But we had already at that point, I think, also started our reading group, which of course began already online, since it was 3 curators, us 3, plus the curatorial assistants at MoMA and in Bern. And so we had already planned to have these weekly or every other week, I think weekly at that point, meetings where we had set ourselves a syllabus, reading basically every exhibition catalog or book or article. I say close to every kind of piece of literature about Meret Oppenheim, from beginning with the most recent and going all the way back to the exhibition catalogs from 1936. And so we had already started that process, and we're already having these conversations every Wednesday on, I think at that point it was on Skype. And then we just started having them from our homes. And it was, in a way, a sort of wonderful mechanism to keep the show afloat and to keep, of course, in touch between the group, because we always had these standing meetings to talk about Meret Oppenheim and talk about the status of our mini loan requests and talk about what was going on in our respective institutions too.
Yeah, so but we just got a question from Lucas if, you know, the show was supposed to start in Bern or if COVID changed the order of institutions around. We were maybe one of the very few projects that kept the original idea of scheduling. So we were very lucky in that sense that we, I must say, by in our case, changing around everything else, because we wanted to honor this collaboration as much as we could. So we tried to accommodate this by changing other projects, but keeping this in the original orders, starting the exhibition in Bern. And we were lucky that it now seems like it's possible in the planned way. Knock on wood. We're still at risk, of course, and we're fully aware of this. But also, we were able to use the sort of hard lockdown period as the period where we would have to do most of our reading, and we had Lee Collin from the New York side and Nora Lona, who did on the Bern side. They both did an incredible job and putting lots of research materials for us online, and we could share them. We put them on a shared drive so we could all access them. For me, this was also a new way to collaborate, sharing the materials and checking in online in a video call every week with each other, and that way also forcing each other to do the reading, like homework at school. Yes. And I would be very ashamed if I would have to, and I sometimes had to report to Natalie, to Anne, and to you, Natalie, that I had not done my homework.
Sometimes all of us, I think, that had small lapses.
Yeah, but it was the best period, and it totally forced us to get to a level of commitment also to investment, and also increase our dialogue and the level of our dialogue, because we would be learning and challenging each other in better ways the more we had read and understood or not understood and had better questions, at least. Yeah,
and I think that speaks to how really collaborative the whole process was, already from fall of 2018, that we had always arrived at decisions of what to be included in a communal way through, conversation or debate, but that we all were basically on the same page. And those weekly reading groups really cemented that and helped us all develop a kind of, shared vocabulary around the artist and around the show, where perhaps we, not to say that we always were in total agreement, but that we, sort of got at least on the same page with one another in terms of how we were thinking about her, surrealist work, or the work from the so-called crisis years, from the early 40s to the mid 1950s and the post-war period. So having a sort of dedicated time set out each week to really process those and learn about those moments in her career through this sort of reverse chronological survey of the literature was, it was just amazing. And I think it also helped, not only, with us knowing about her work, but also, of course, it made us, I feel like I learned a lot about just the history of Meret Oppenheim exhibitions kind of as such. The last exhibition of Meret Oppenheim in the United States was in 1996, so it was about 25 years ago. And there have been more in Europe, one in 2013, 2006, etc. But it was so interesting to approach how, or to discover how each had a different view onto her work and how ours would make a different contribution.
And then there came the point where we had to decide on what topics to write for the exhibition catalog. So how did you get to pick the topic you wrote about?
How did we arrive at that? I mean, I think that you, Nina, had always had this interest in her post-war work, right? And this conviction that she should be put into context with post-war art movements, which had not been done before, right? So that was a kind of project that you had been like eager to. Is that right?
True.
And then Anne and I in the catalog wrote about Meret Oppenheim's surrealist work, I suppose we could say, though it sort of goes by that. It goes from when she arrived in Paris in 1932. She returns to Basel, Switzerland in 1936-37 and produces a totally different series of paintings for about 7 years, and then experiences what has become known as the crisis, sort of low period where she doesn't make a lot of new work. She destroys some of her old work until 1954. 1954 is where Nina's essay picks up. So that is what I wrote about. And Anne wrote with Lee Cologne at MoMA about this fascinating late project that Oppenheim embarked upon in 1983, where she created what's known as her imaginary exhibition, or Mon exposition, which is where the title of our show comes from, where she drew on 12 identically sized, pretty large sheets of paper, works from her career to scale that she would include in a hypothetical imaginary retrospective of her own work. So as Anne was saying before, it's like a really sort of conceptual art project. And then in 1984, so 1 year after the drawings themselves were created, a version, I suppose, of this exhibition was mounted in Bern at the Kunsthalle Bern, and Meret Oppenheim was there to help install the show, which maybe brings us full circle a little bit to your exhibition display right now, Nina, with the banners.
Yes, and I think it fell right into place, with every institution's special interest. Like you looking at the surrealist work made so much sense in an institution that has
that's good to
such a surrealist collection to place her and think of her placement in this collection. I felt this was ideal, that you would start out in the catalog with these questions that are also like the basis of her artistic thoughts and developments, and so many of the themes that we discover through all periods. It makes such a great entry to give her the basis that she's nourished from until her late work, although it changes and it opens up more and more, but that's definitely where it comes from. And then I also felt it was such a perfect theme for Anne to look at just the Mon exposition, sort of the most meta
Yeah.
the meta project. It was like when she said she was interested in the conceptual side of Meret Oppenheim, this maybe is the most conceptual approach Meret ever had on her entire oeuvre, which is connected, of course, also to her starting the catalog Raisonné. She worked with Dominique Bürgi at the time together. That was then published also. So in a way, it was pretty natural that I wanted to be on, like, the post-war work, where I felt this is a lot of work we have in the collection and that I want to question. And Anne wanted to address the big overall conceptual questions in the end, and very happy it fell in place like this.
It did just sort of fall right into place.
And so I had you mentioned the panels, then the big wall panels of those who have seen the Bern. I don't know if people listening here, if everybody, probably not, assume not, had a chance to see the exhibition in Bern. So it's really starts with the reproductions of the actual Kunsthalle Bern 1984 exhibition, and we blew these reproductions up very largely and installed them in the hall of the Kunstmuseum Bern. So the Kunsthalle Bern and the Kunstmuseum Bern are two very different things. The Kunsthalle is a beautiful neoclassicist but contemporary art space. And we, of course, are a traditional museum that has a collection from like medieval art to now, and the spaces look very different. We're blending these two spaces together because we wanted to bring the spirit of the 84 exhibition right into our building, and we wanted to stress the importance of Meret Oppenheim claiming that this is her exhibition, this, putting a "my" on this exhibition as a word. I think we discovered how important that gesture that was. And I think this was through the reading group that I learned this, through all the great materials Lee Collin and Nora Lona found for us, especially for me from the archive, all the letters and commentaries Meret Oppenheim left for critics who had done interviews with her, or for art historians writing about her. There was one big theme, becoming stronger and stronger, and there was she getting, how can I put that into good words? Like her voice getting stronger in the late 60s and 70s, and her voice making sense of her own work and correcting other voices that wanted to place her where she didn't want to be, became for me such a big part of who she was. I don't know, how did you?
Yes, I mean, I think that's completely right, that she was so involved in, adamant about, active in the process of writing her own history, of correcting, of giving interviews, but correcting them. She was very involved in drafting her catalog Raisonné. It's a project that she began already in, I believe, the 1960s. And so she was aware for a long time of the need for her to, in some ways, intervene or set the historical record straight. I think in part because she had achieved such meteoric fame in 1936 at such a young age, with the exhibition of the fur-lined teacup at the Museum of Modern Art in December of 1936, when she was just 23 years old. It became a kind of icon of surrealism, an icon of 20th century art very, very quickly after that show. in a way became, I think, sort of curiously detached from her, though. I found, at least in this country, it's pretty common that or it's not uncommon maybe, that if you say, oh, I'm working on Meret Oppenheim, non-art people might not know who she is, but if you show her an image of the Fräulein teacup, they say, oh, that, I know, I've seen that. I've seen it in like TV shows or pop culture. And so I think perhaps because she'd become so famous, but in a way that was detached from her name and completely detached from the rest of her work that she would produce for the next 50 years, she was really involved in sort of shaping and crafting her legacy already from the 1960s on. But she did, you know, I would say that those Mon Exposition drawings, which are included in in our exhibition, they were not, she did not, I think, intend them to be a kind of blueprint, right, for future exhibitions. She very importantly writes on the first sheet that this is one example of a possible retrospective, but one among many examples. So they're not prescriptive, and we did not set out to adhere to those sheets, right? We, as you've said, Nina, we kind of took our freedom, right?
Yes, so this is already to Lucasen's next question, which is a great question. Did we take then Meret Oppenheim's drawings sort of as a recipe for our exhibition? This could have been a way, like for other, in another project, this could have made sense. Oh, the artist herself depicted a version of her exhibition. Of course, we as curators, this is sort of the first thing we go to. We look at if this is the solution for, which works to select and how to install them. But then we learned much more. We learned that, as you said, Meret Oppenheim made a point of giving everybody freedom in making their own exhibitions with her work and not wanting to be so specific that this is the only possible way. And it would also, quite frankly, not have been possible. Like a lot of the work that's on the drawings is today lost or inaccessible or too fragile to travel. So, it would not open up her work for future generations. If she had prescribed that as the final recipe, it would have closed her work for future generations and made it impossible. So she, geniusly handed us over the key to freedom by saying, this is one of 1,000 possibilities, and here you go. But I do remember Anne and Lee and, studying the drawing so closely that they know the combinations. So they would often like say, oh, I think this work works really well with the other one. And they are combined in the Mon Exposition drawings. So I think we're quoting, that's why we're quoting moments from there, but we're not, adhering to the recipe as a Stalinist manifesto. Yeah.
And I think that, one kind of key that we have all taken from the way that she presented those Mon Exposition drawings is that she arranged them chronologically, right? And so our exhibitions in Bern, in Houston, and in New York will be, more or less, it's not as though every single thing is presented like 32, 33, 34. There is some mixing, but in generally, it's a sort of chronological journey through the exhibition galleries, that as you advance through the galleries, you're advancing further in time and further into her work. So that's one cue that we took from her and from those drawings. And I think too, I was thinking about this earlier, that she represented every period of her career in those. So even the so-called crisis years that were sort of low point for her creatively, she included works from that moment. And so And I think that's another way in which our retrospective is a kind, you know, sort of tips its hat at that, at her approach to curating her own exhibition too. So there are these, you know, inspirations that we maybe took from that project of hers. And then, yeah, of course, the drawings themselves, the like physical objects, are included in all of our presentations too, which is a very fun, I mean, I loved seeing them at the end of your exhibition, Nina, and they're
it was, we had like many thoughts of where to place them, because they could be anywhere. They could be, of course, technically she makes them in 83, 84, so they should be at the end of the exhibition as work, as a drawing she's making. But then they're like different than the rest of the work, because they're work about work also. And how for the longest time, I didn't know how to curatorially deal with that specific status of these works. And then I got advice from our curator, Marta Dziwanska, who said, why don't you like separate them from the course, the chronological course from the exhibition, and show them after the end of the exhibition. And then we show a film, like a documentary film about her. And then when you think the exhibition is already over, that room comes with the series of drawings and suddenly makes the connections to the large wallpaper you've been walking around all the time. So this is really Marta's idea, which, you know, immediately made sense and helped me a lot to sort of create a unity then for our space. Yes.
And it's fun to see them at the end because, of course, an attentive viewer of the show will realize, you know, oh, I saw that in the first gallery. I mean, it almost becomes a kind of game of like hunting out works that you've seen just in the last hour of walking through the exhibition. But there are a lot of, you know, Anne and I sort of were musing when we were walking through the show, like, oh, you know, if maybe one could put them in the very middle of the show as a kind of key to the show, or you could split them up and put one in each gallery or something. So I think we'll all find our different solutions, but because they are a little bit separate from the work, but also are, of course, a drawing that she made too. So those are really fun. I remember finding those, or not finding them from scratch, but seeing them for the first time when we were on that viewing trip in October of 2018, and we were all just, totally enthralled at the idea that she had looked back on her practice in this sustained, thoughtful, creative, imaginative way. It was fascinating and became, of course, the fodder for one of our essays. So discovery.
No, totally. No, we will be looking forward to, the very, very different solutions you'll have to find for your space. And a lot of the work, as we learned, is sometimes spanning over 60 years. So Meret is starting to make a drawing in the 30s. Then she's producing a work that got lost or destroyed, or she's redoing it in the 60s, but gives it a date in the 30s because the idea is from the 30s. And sometimes she's expanding on these works in the 60s or in the 80s. So technically, you could fit these works in any of these periods. And we generally decided to put the work at the time where they were originally perceived, even if they were reproduced, like the My Nurse, Ma Gouvernante, which is, the idea and the original piece that's photographed is from the 30s, but it was destroyed and she reproduced it in the 60s. So we felt it should be in the 30s, but there's so many reasons also to say, oh my God, it makes sense in the 60s as well. So, for these choices alone, your exhibition could look completely different.
Yeah, that sort of circularity or her habit of going back and picking up an idea that she had first sketched in like 1942 and realizing it in one case in 1985. I mean, the way that these ideas sort of lodged in her mind, and I really have the sense of her ruminating on them or sort of processing them, and then they emerge in actual sort of three-dimensional form many years later. I mean, that's a kind of interesting constant of her practice too, that yes, does present some questions like which room should this, sort of properly speaking, go?
Yes,
it makes it open, which is also
which is good. So which is what I'm really curious to find out later. So I realize we have not invited the audience to ask questions, because we were just already in the middle of our conversation. So if anybody else has a question for us, we're already near the end of our talk, but please, you can type your question in the chat function. You can ask your question in German or English or French. We will understand, translate, and try to answer it if we can. Totally fine if you don't have any other questions. We're just going to invite you to ask them if you've been listening and been wondering something. We're here to give you insights on how this all happened. And so I have so many other things here. I also wanted to ask you about the crisis period, Natalie. Remember, we've been obsessed with the crisis period. We learned so much about these years, and this has been such a part of our conversation also. But maybe we can go into all different directions now. There's so many.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all got really interested, or this sort of crisis moment, which is variously dated as being from the early 40s or so, but is certainly by Oppenheim herself dated as ending in 1954. She writes it as though it's a kind of epiphanic discovery that in 1954, all of a sudden, this crisis, this depression that she's been living under lifts, and she starts making work again in a very intensive way. But the years before, 10, 15 years before then, have been written about a lot in the literature as a period in which she made no work, or has been sort of mythologized in a lot of different ways in the Meret Oppenheim literature. And one thing that I felt in writing about it a little bit in my essay was important to, state is that although it was certainly, if you look at the catalog raisonné, it's undeniable that those later 40s to 1954, that span of time, was a low period for her. She didn't produce a lot of work, and we know that she destroyed a lot of the works, earlier works that she had created. But I did want to, make a point that it's not as though she completely abstained from art making altogether. I think that was one important point that I wanted to make. And a lot of times too, I think discussions of the crisis have it starting, as soon as she returns as soon as she leaves Paris in 36, 37 and goes back to Basel. So she's there where she lives throughout the war years, throughout World War II and after. And, one thing that I thought was also interesting to point out is that she created a lot of these mythological, fantastical, narrative, figurative paintings during that moment, and that she also was enrolled in art school and was learning, taking anatomy classes and learning the sort of fine art technical details of painting in those early years too, in like 1937 to 1941, 42. So although it was, of course, quite isolating and in many ways depressing for her to have left Paris and the avant-garde community of surrealism of which she had been a part, she was at the same time learning new skills. And I think, you know, in some of those paintings, you can see her really kind of enthusiastically engaging with the like art and materiality of painting. So one thing that I wanted to recover, and then I'll stop this sort of ramble, is just that there wasn't a solely sort of dark period for her, that there were also moments of inspiration and productivity and enjoyment in the work of making art. And that's I'll leave it at that.
No, and I think there was an interesting period to rediscover and reevaluate, and I learned a lot from, you know, your questioning that period and looking at it in a very new way. I think that's a very interesting chapter of the exhibition. And I think we didn't get another question. So
yeah, I don't see any others in the chat.
Yeah, so you know, we leave it at this point, and there's of course so much more to discover. We're inviting everybody to you know, to see all 3 exhibitions till mid-February in Bern. When are you opening in Houston?
We open on March 26th.
March 26th. So that's the next dates to have in mind.
Yeah,
and
it's here for several months.
Over the you know, over the entire next months, and then in next fall coming to New York to MoMA. So it's been such a pleasure, and as you see, the problem was almost, you know, I was always already in the evening and it was getting dark, and my home office was getting badly lit while you're in bright daylight. I do see that again. So this was constantly
we're always, you know, at the end of your days, and we're grateful that you make time in your extremely busy director life to time every week.
All our busy lives. So this was, you know, we wanted to share this with you, our audience, because this was so much a part of this show, our, you know, video preparing it. So you know, we wanted to make it a moment also in the program to share that. So thanks for having listened to us. Thanks for being interested in everything around Meret Oppenheim, and hope to see you not only online but also physically. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are. And thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for organizing our conversation today.